Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Q&A about business innovation and managing life. We took a break for a couple of weeks because I was off doing my annual sort of extreme professoring activity. We had our summer school, which we've been doing for 20 years, and our summer camp for high school students, which I guess we've been doing for about a dozen years. And it's my job to, among other things, come up with original projects, research projects for everybody who's there. There's like 130 projects this year. It's very interesting, very fun, but that's what I was up to. All right, let's see. So we have all kinds of questions here. I see one from our submission form from Zorbads. In science, when is it preferable to self-publish rather than going through academic journals? Well, let's see. I think the thing to understand is academic journals are a distribution channel. If you've got a product that, for which it's if you're selling, I don't know, fruit or something, then you're sort of probably better off if there's an existing place that sells fruit to get your fruit carried by that existing fruit selling place, because people who are looking to buy fruit are likely to go to the fruit stand. And it will cost you something to get your fruit placed at the fruit stand, but nevertheless, it will give you immediate exposure to customers who are interested in buying fruit. And it's kind of the same thing with academic journals. If your customers are coming to that journal anyway to read about things, then that's a good place to get your product, in this case, your paper or whatever, published there. Of course, there's a cost. It's complicated. It has that distribution channel has some has sort of a barrier to entry. I will say that in modern times, I don't know how modern, it's been 40 years or something now, the sort of the preprint system where you upload to archive or some other suitable preprint system, the things you're writing, that's sort of an intermediate case that isn't quite the official academic journals. What's the value of the official academic journals? I'm not really sure, because I think most things people might read as sort of paper type things are available on archive, and I don't really know why people go to specific academic journals other than because it represents a way of somebody else having done the selection of those papers, and it's convenient. If you're going to that fruit stand anyway, then you'll see this weird kind of new tropical fruit or something that was some kind of paper that's there. Now, there are several different aspects to this. I mean, one is if you have a following of people who are reading about the things that you're writing about, and you've just got a website in which people are going to come to that website and read the things that you're writing about, then you don't really need to go and put your things on somebody else's website as well. I think that the trade-off that I've seen in my own efforts has often been, if you're doing something which is sufficiently new and perhaps original that there isn't a well-defined distribution channel for it, then it doesn't really work to send it through the existing distribution channels, because they're like, this isn't for us. This isn't, doesn't fit in our distribution channel. You invented a new, fruit vegetable combo or something. That's probably not going to fit on the fruit stand, so to speak. And it's and you're going to have you can push hard to get the round fruit to fit into the square hole, so to speak, but it will be difficult and it may not work, and it's not necessarily the right thing. And so it is with science. If you have things that are sort of original kinds of things that are really major new directions, then it becomes more difficult to fit that into the distribution channel of things like journals, because the thing you have to realize is the vast majority of science, of all the millions of papers that are published every year, the vast majority, needless to say, because there are millions of them, are very incremental. They're small advances that say, we're building on this big tower that's already been built, we're going to add this little tiny piece to the top. not necessarily not worthwhile. Sometimes I think it isn't tremendously worthwhile, but in general, the aggregate of that is, new bricks are being put on the top of the tower, and eventually that makes the whole tower kind of advance. I think the thing that makes so if you're doing something that is more kind of you're creating a new area of science or something like this, something I've been involved in doing in my time, then it really doesn't make sense to say let's find an academic journal where that fits, because it's not going to fit anywhere. And that's and then of course in the way academic journals are set up, there have been a variety of models, but well, let me explain the evolution. I mean, academic journals started in the 1600s with things like Proceedings of the Royal Society, and they were like blogs at that time. People would show up at the society and wherever it was in London, and they would give a little talk about how they went to the top of this mountain and they observed this strange atmospheric phenomenon, and they're going to report about it. And as they were doing that, an eagle swooped down and so on. And it's very blog-like description. They're kind of fun to read in many cases. Some were a little bit more kind of desiccated, but the idea was people were giving reports, and there was a written record of those reports. Very kind of blog-like idea. Subsequently, things got a lot more kind of formalized, and your average academic paper of today is written in a very formal style. In some fields like mathematics, it has the annoying feature that it tells you neither why the thing was, in many cases, neither tells you why the thing was done, nor really how the person thought about it to get to the results they got to. Because what it presents is, consider this thing. Why do we consider it? Who knows? Here's a theorem about it. Okay, how did you ever come up with that theorem? Not said. It's just like, here's the thing. It's almost like it's kind of like, here's the answer, and we're just telling you this. We're not telling you why we asked the question. We're not telling you how you got to the answer, but here's the answer, so to speak. And that's something, that's a style of writing that is certainly, if you want to kind of sort of just say, here's a sequence of answers, fine. But in terms of people really understanding what's going on, it's not a great way to do it. So I think now it has to be said that there's been sort of, because science has been such a large enterprise, there've been these kind of these efforts to make it kind of streamlined, and how do we know whether what's published in some journal is actually right or not? Well, good luck with that. The fact is, it's checking whether something is right is really hard. Even people imagine, even in some areas of mathematics where you could sort of imagine formally checking something, that's almost never what's actually done. And when that is what's done, it's not usually a very original thing that is being said. So it's but there's this idea which developed, I don't know when it developed, probably in the early part of the 20th century, I'm not sure. This idea of peer review. What had happened at the very beginning, Proceedings of the Royal Society, things like that, it was just, if you were a member of the society, you just came and gave your speech and somebody recorded it. Later on, it was like there was a named editor, Krell's Journal of Mathematics or something. And, Professor Krell would decide what gets published and what doesn't. And you knew it was their fault if something goofy got published, or if something great got published or whatever. And I think then as publishing maybe got more commercialized, maybe got more involved with professional societies, things like that, not quite sure what the driver was, then this idea of sort of let's just throw it out to the crowd and have this kind of anonymous peer review mechanism. I'm not even sure why it was anonymous, even from the beginning. I mean, it's like perhaps it was kind of in a model of sort of democratic voting and speak your mind better if it's anonymous. But that led to just, it's not a great system. From outside of science, people say, oh, there's peer review. It guarantees that everything in science is right. From inside science, it just looks pretty cruddy. Some people, I'm afraid, well, there's several things that happen. One thing people do is they don't really check what their work very carefully. They just say, I'm not going to check my work. The peer reviewers will check my work. Well, maybe they will, maybe they won't, or maybe just some complete nonsense will get published. That's one thing that happens. The other thing that happens is it becomes a bizarre kind of political, sort of semi-corrupt, popularity contest of, oh, if you've referred to the right papers at the end of your paper, then the peer reviewer, if you refer to their papers, they'll say, oh, it's great. I'll sort of follow a natural selection principle of citations and accept your paper. And if you didn't, I'll reject your paper. But it's very challenging to get people to even read papers in enough detail that they'd be able to tell whether they made any sense. I mean, I very, very rarely, do sort of reviews for journals, almost never, the last many decades. But I had a principle that I started many decades ago that I would never do them anonymously. Bizarrely, some journals would say, if you're not going to do it anonymously, we don't want your review. It's like, really? Why? Does that actually make any sense? I don't see the logic of that. And my point of view about it is, I try and be constructive. Sometimes I'll say, I think what you've written is nonsense. But here's the thing you might do constructively to improve it. Or things like, look, what you're writing is quite interesting, but the way you've written it is so poorly presented that nobody's ever going to understand it. You're not doing yourself a service. It's attempt to be constructive rather than just sort of the thumbs up, thumbs down thing. And I think that's a great that's a potential service for peer review, but it takes a lot of work. And I think for many people, they're not prepared to do that. So I would say that my basic answer, a thing that I noticed when I used to publish papers in academic journals, which I haven't done in 35 years or so, is when my papers were rather trivial and very incremental, they sailed right through the process. It's like, great, it fits into our fruit stand, we'll present it here, it's all good. When what I had to say was kind of original, it was like, oh, what about this? Oh, we don't understand that. Oh, this or that or the other. And it's like, I lost enthusiasm for it. I took the point of view, maybe if I'm on the editorial board of some journal, so I don't need to go through that, maybe I'll publish something there. Otherwise, it's like, I'm not doing it that way because it's just too high cost. It's like I said, with distribution channels, you're trying to stuff the round thing in the square hole. It's difficult to do, and it's not clear that the distribution channel is particularly valuable for that. In some cases, there are things where people will say, I'm expecting to read something incremental in this journal. Oh my gosh, this is really original. I don't understand that. That doesn't fit. But, as a practical matter, it's not easy in the world in general to get out sort of new ideas and new concepts and things are hard to get out into the world. I mean, I've spent I've generated quite a number of new things like that in my time, and it is a difficult decision how much time you should really spend telling the world about what you've done versus how much time you should spend building new things. Sometimes I don't know. I've tried to you tell the world things a certain amount, you go to a certain amount of effort, and then eventually you might decide the world is just not ready for this. Good example of this is our physics project, where back in the 1990s, I made pretty nice sort of early progress on figuring out things about how a fundamental theory of physics might work. I finished my book, A New Kind of Science, in 2002. I gave a bunch of talks about what was in the book, and I gave some talks that got a million views online and things like this. And some of those talks I talked about, and this is how one could go forward to make a theory of physics based on this. And lots of people care about theories of physics. But even though millions of people watched those talks, nobody did anything. Well, actually, more accurately, two young physicists eventually, nearly 20 years later, kind of are like, yeah, let's work on this. And that's how our physics project ended up getting done. But over the course of 20 years and millions of people exposed to ideas, and I like to think I'm not so bad at explaining ideas, nevertheless, nobody really did anything. And that's not an uncommon situation. And it's something where you have to decide, if you've got some great thing you figured out, you can, there's a certain amount of kind of marketing of that idea that you can do. And if you could spend, there are people I know who had one idea that they had when they were quite young, and they spent the whole of the rest of their life essentially marketing that idea with varying degrees of success. And that may not be a good calculation to do that. So I think it's a challenging thing. And basically my answer to the original question was, if your thing is incremental and it fits right into the distribution channel of academic journals, that's the thing to do. If it doesn't, well, you've got potentially a hard road ahead, and it's not clear whether academic journals play a useful role there. Let's see, there's a question here just following a couple of these more academic questions, then we'll talk about other kinds of things. Harry asks, what place do you see for competitive behavior, especially in respect to the paper citation system in science? Different people are motivated by different things. I am rather anti-motivated by competition, because my personal point of view is, if somebody else is going to do it, why not I just let them do it? Rather than, I've got plenty of things I want to do, I'll do something nobody else thinks they want to do. Now, sometimes rather than, I'm going to try and be the one who finishes first in this race, I don't find that terribly motivating. There are other people I know who find that the most motivating thing. And if you say to them, go out into the wilderness and sort of make a new, city in the middle of the jungle type thing, they're like, oh my God, I don't want to do that. But if you say there's this race and there are 10 other people running in it, and you can run in it as well, and you might be the winner, they're like, great, I'm going to do that. And they're highly motivated and they work very hard, and potentially they're the winner. So I think it depends on the personality of the person, whether that's a good motivator or not. I think that it can be, with respect to papers and citations and so on. I know I haven't been in the academic business myself for a long time. When I was in the academic business, the question of, sort of, did you get ahead and get hired and get promoted and so on, it was a very kind of fuzzy type of question, where it was like, well, do people think you're great? And, do people think this or that or the other? I believe in the intervening years that it's gotten a little bit more, quote, scientific, and I put big quotes around that, and that people are counting, oh, how many citations did your paper get? If you get more than X number of citations, then you get a promotion, kind of thing. I think, sounds, it's kind of like in a company setting, there are certain positions where you might say, yes, it's a very numbers-based thing. If you're a salesperson, for example, you might say, how good were your numbers? If you are a person who is, I don't know, doing some other very measurable thing, like you're, I don't know, a translator, for example, translating texts, that might be, again, something where you can say, how many pages did you translate? For many other kinds of areas, it really, as soon as you put, hard metrics on things, it's a complicated thing, because somebody could say, well, I don't know, how many, how many functions did you build? Well, or how many lines of code did you write? Well, you can write cruddy code and you can write great code, and the number of lines written is not necessarily a good measure of that. And similarly, there are definitely people I know even who, optimize their papers for citability, so to speak, because they are, gaming the system to get more citations. Or you'll find these loops of, one group will cite another group, and the first group will cite the two groups will co-cite each other, and you'll end up with these things where sort of there's a sort of a co-citation pact and so on, all kinds of weird gamification that happens. I think that in any one of these systems, any one of these large systems where you try and put these kind of overall kind of structuring constraints on it, you will usually end up with some good things happening and lots of bad things happening. And then you'll gradually kind of, it feels like almost legal code or tax code or something. People will find loopholes, they'll do things you didn't intend them to do, and then some bad thing will develop, even though maybe the main part of what happened as a result of that legal code or whatever it was pretty good. So, I think the same is true in science. I mean, I happen to believe that a lot of things that happen in science today are, well, they're very much against serious innovation. There are things where it's a very large structure, very institutionalized, and it is good at dealing with kind of keep the system flowing. It's like many large companies where the cogs are running in a certain way, and the company can run those cogs in a nice sort of well-oiled way if all the cogs are running together. But if there's some new innovative thing that needs to happen, that doesn't work in that system. And the same is true in science. We'd like to figure out, in fact, one of the projects at our new Wolfram Institute will be trying to figure out some different ways to understand the loop by which basic research can be done. Because basic research, for example, is pretty much being done, at least in the short term, purely for the public good, because it isn't something where there's going to be sort of a short-term payoff. That's what sort of the definition of basic research tends to be. Sometimes one lucks out, but oftentimes it's something where, the payoff for society might be a century away. And so there's sort of a question of even though everybody thinks it's a good thing to do, how do you actually get it done? And is the only way to do that having governments pay for it and things like this? We're trying to figure out whether, for example, in the modern, blockchain tokenized world and so on, with different kinds of incentive structures, different kinds of ways to maintain and generate value, whether there's some different way to achieve the thing that many people think should be achieved of advancing basic research in a different fashion. But so that's a thing for the future. Oh boy, many questions and comments here. Parker asks, what do you think will be a good replacement for peer review? Look, something where it's like, this is so-and-so's journal or so-and-so's section of a journal, and they are responsible. And it's, I think that's a good start for those kinds of things. I think that, the anonymity and the closedness is really, really kind of awful. I think that it's also a question of what is the brief of the peer reviewer. I mean, I just agreed to do one review of something for a good friend of mine who'd been bugging me about this for months. The complicated situation with multiple sort of people and personal issues at stake. And, it's really a story of, at some level, I think it's, I think the thing is, can you be constructive? You're really, it's kind of like a mentoring function, or it should be. It's kind of like somebody sends something in and you're like, you're like, well, I can understand this, or I don't really understand it. But let's say you do understand it, and you're really it's not really a peer review at that point. It's really, you actually understand more than the author understood. Then can you give kind of a good mentoring type response that is constructive, which might also be, hey, this is great. It's all good, but don't really have any comments. Or it might be, look, there's all kinds of problems with this, and here's a suggestion for what you might do. Let's see. Pascal asks, have I ever considered working in finance instead of in physics? Many very smart people work for trading companies. Back in the early 90s, I had this idea that, maybe I should sort of take a break and, have fun doing what was then becoming popular of sort of do finance type stuff and sort of, have a hedge fund type thing. I didn't, largely because I had a day job running our company, but I also had already a very big sort of night job of working on a new kind of science. And in the decade or so that I worked on that, I didn't have sort of any other outside hobbies, so to speak. Many, probably most quant hedge funds use our software, Wolfram language, Mathematica, and so on. Lots. I don't know in detail what any of them do because they all consider it very private and secret, and I don't want or need to know kind of any of those details. I have to say, I myself don't find, for me personally, the kind of doing things that are clever, that make money, sort of for the sake of doing things that are clever and making money, doesn't happen to appeal to me personally. I know plenty of people to whom it appeals well, where kind of the thing that is very satisfying is solving the problem. You win, and maybe winning to some extent is something very satisfying. For me personally, I'm much more into creating things and understanding things than I am into kind of solving problems and winning, so to speak. So it's not for me personally, it's not a particularly good match. I think sometimes I have to admit that I feel myself being a little disappointed that so many analytically bright people go into finance kinds of areas, because it doesn't feel like it's something that is as constructive as lots of other things that could be done in the world. Now, it's not to say that there's no value to sort of the efficiency of markets generated by this or that thing. There's probably some value there, but I think that the amount of brain power that goes into that far exceeds what the likely value to the world of those things is. Now, of course, for any individual, value to the world isn't the calculation that you're necessarily doing. You might enjoy providing value for the world. I happen to feel I happen to enjoy that. Other people are more interested in providing value for themselves, so to speak, and it's a different calculation. So the answer is I've not really been very tempted by that, not least because I've had intense both day job and creative activities that I've engaged in, and frankly, I have more than a lifetime's worth of those things sort of that I already know I want to do, and so I think beyond the occasional sort of helping out with suggestions, I don't think that's my scene. It's sometimes I feel like it's always a complicated thing, because there are things where I say, gosh, if we had more money to do things, we would be able to do more. I realize for the things that I do that it's not, we couldn't spend an infinite amount of money doing the things that I find fulfilling to do. Probably we could spend more than we have, but we couldn't spend sort of an infinite amount. I've noticed that there are things where we might own something or do something where it's sort of an attached thing, and I find that for me personally, it's not as fulfilling, because yes, it's the thing, yeah, it's making some money here or there, but it's not something that I'm personally deeply intellectually engaged in, and for me, that's the interesting thing. So let's see. Comment from Harry that sometimes they think we waste some of our brightest minds on making money. Yeah, well, certainly that's a point of view, and I think one of the things I notice in some of the elite educational institutions, both at the sort of high school and college level, it's kind of it's like, well, what are all these people going to do when they're grown up? Well, they're going to be in the finance sector. It's weird. It's not always been that way. Maybe it won't always be that way. In a sense, I think it's a tendency towards increasing, I wouldn't say virtualization, but increasing abstraction in the world. I mean, there was a time when the way you made a good living was by making very concrete things. You kind of are, you're kind of going up in abstraction levels by saying, well, we're not actually going to make things, we're going to make things to make things. That's perhaps the world that I'm in, of making tools to make things. And although I like to think we also make some stuff that's very worthwhile too, but then you can get to the point where we're making tools to make tools to enable the financial aspect of making this or that thing happen. It's kind of gone up in multiple abstraction levels in kind of how one interacts with the world. And I think one of the things that's a little odd is that, yes, smart people are needed to operate at the high abstraction level that is modern finance, so to speak. Whether that high abstraction level has what that means sort of down to earth is not so clear. I mean, it's an interesting question, sort of in the economic way of thinking about things. Sort of where is value in the world, and is it the case that we like to think there's obvious value in things that are very tangible products that one makes. There's value in enabling those tangible products to be made. There's sort of value in simplifying the path to get this or that thing to happen. But sort of where do you get to the point where you're sort of at too high a level of abstraction and you're really just spinning around on your own? And one might say that some of modern finance has gotten to that point. It's also, from a purely personal point of view, I would say that I certainly see a lot of people I consider very capable who go into finance. They often win big, they make lots of money. Sometimes they use that money to do interesting things that they find really fulfilling. Sometimes they don't. I do feel that there's, to some extent, there tends to be a bit of a track where people say, I'm going to this, I'm going to this fancy high school. I'm going to do well. I'm going to get A's and everything. I'm going to, I'm running that race on that track. I'm going to go to the fancy college. I'm running that race on that track. And then, okay, you get to the end of that. Now I want to run another race on another track. And the obvious track is the finance industry. And so people go into that, and then pretty soon they realize they spent their whole life running a race on that track. And for some people, that's fulfilling. For others, it's like, oh my gosh, what on earth did I just spend the last X number of decades doing? Let's see. So Parker is commenting, could we somehow shift the market demand for technology to highly favor intellectual development and ideas sufficiently so that these analytically bright people are interested in scientific progress? Well, at different times, there are different areas where people with different skills get pulled in. I mean, okay. So in these different fields, when money is a driver, there's ways that can happen. So for example, in finance, one of the big drivers is if you're in the finance industry, you tend to be a middle person between this and that happening. And often you get to take a cut of all of the flow of money there, and that can be very big. And that's as a person, working in that world, you'll tend to have a deal where you get a cut of the money that's made. Different industries, that's not how it works. I don't know, for example, I don't really know what's happened in the ad tech industry, whether that's a place where people successfully set themselves up to get kind of a cut of the winnings, or whether that's more like a fixed fee type area. In science, for example, where there aren't usually big winnings. I mean, occasionally there'll be some breakthrough that has an immediate sort of, near few decade application in the pharmaceutical industry or in the software industry or something like that. But usually, by the time the science is really applied, it's been quite, it's been quite modified relative to the original sort of basic science idea. And there isn't a good mechanism to connect the value generation of that basic science with the things that actually get done that are directly connected to making money. So yeah, that's a thing that we're interested in figuring out, how to make a better connection, how to figure out how to sort of more have sort of value that is more visibly accrues to things like basic science, and maybe that will change some of the balance of this. Let's see. Universe asks, how do you decide to direct your behavior when faced with aggression in tense meetings? That's an interesting question. I don't know, I live streamed many meetings, and I'm sure there's some aggression in some of those meetings. The thing that, when other people are aggressive, one of my points of view is that's great. They really care. Now, it's kind of a, I tend to be fairly, when there's lots of aggression around, I tend to be fairly, well, let's figure out what the actual point is. Let's try and see, what are we really arguing about, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. What gets bad, and what I personally always tend to try to avoid, is when it's really a personal piece of aggression, as opposed to, I really care about the ideas, I really care about what we're doing, I really care about the strategy. When it's just like, I can't stand working with that person, that's a different issue. It doesn't usually happen in meetings that I'm in. It's usually aggression about the thing one's talking about the content. Now, I have to say, one of the things that I always find an issue is that sometimes people just won't listen unless you're fairly aggressive. And people are like, oh yeah, well, we do this and this and this. It's like, or, oh, well, we'll get to it in the end, and, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And you have to be very pushy. And sometimes you have to ratchet up, in my experience, that level of aggression to just get people to actually pay attention. It's like kind of a piece of metadata of, yes, he really cares about this. He's really pushing, as opposed to just like, well, I guess we can put it on the list and it'll be down at the 28th priority, slot in the priority order and things like this. But if you're really being aggressive about it, it's kind of a signal that you really care. I think that's, now I've also found, I will say, that I've worked with many, many people in my life, many very talented people, and many people with very different personalities. And they're people I might have worked with for decades, where there's never any aggression, because it's just like, we understand each other. They say, if I don't know what I'm talking about, I don't know what they're talking about, we can communicate that way. And there's places where they just don't seem to listen, and you have to kind of ratchet up the aggression level. And sometimes there are people where you feel a little bit like, oh my God, I shouldn't be doing this. I'm being very, very aggressive, and I'm being, and to some people, that kind of aggression would be horrifying, and would be, they shrink in the face of that kind of aggression. But to other people, it's like they're aggressive too. And you have this great big aggressive argument, so to speak. And in many cases, you find, at the end of the aggressive argument, the person says, oh, okay, I guess you're right. Or they convince you that you're not right. But they say, oh, okay, I guess you're right. And everybody's like, okay, fine, we'll just move on. And it's like, there was no, everything's calm. There was no, it's not like anything happened, so to speak. So I found that in working with different kinds of people, sometimes you end up with situations where kind of aggression is just the communication medium, and other times it isn't. Where it gets tricky is when you have a meeting where there is a person where sort of the communication medium is aggression, but there are other people in the meeting who are more in the kind of fragile flower type category, and where they're having to sort of watch this aggression that's happening. That's not a great situation, and it's one to avoid if one can. I try to avoid it. Let's see, Sleepy is asking, is it possible for low-level employees to prove themselves by solving complex problems in an operation despite lacking the typical formal qualifications of education, but nevertheless be promoted? Depends on the company, depends on the management, it depends on how much attention people are paying. One of the things is, if there's a definite, let's say you're doing sales and somebody just outsells everybody else by a factor of 10, you kind of know what's going on. There's some talent there, and or they just got lucky that particular moment. But if it's sustained, there's talent there. In other places, it's a little less obvious often, because it's not like everybody's solving the same problem and you can compare person A to person B. It might be that person A just got a simpler problem. Now, if you're good at managing people and you're really paying attention, you can tell, person A had a problem that was actually difficult and they managed to, leap tall buildings, so to speak, and they solved that problem. And that's very impressive. And, if you are sort of paying attention in a management point of view, you can, you notice that and you say, great, let's promote that person. Let's give them more of those kinds of problems to solve. Sometimes it's a one-off. Sometimes there's a situation where, for whatever reason, the person just that particular thing that came up, they are uniquely suited to that and they nail it. And then you say, well, what about other things a bit like that, which you think are a bit like it, but you don't notice there's sort of a hidden thing, and then it doesn't really work to kind of promote that person to be like, keep doing those same kinds of things you were doing there. I would say that's the minority case. The majority case is when something sort of impressive has been done, but you have to understand that it's impressive because, and that's not an easy thing to do. And that's often something that requires sort of management, both experience and knowledge of the tasks. Because one of the things that can happen is, does the manager actually understand the tasks that are being done? In many companies, it is, often the case that a manager will just say, I have my key objectives here. Now I'm going to get the worker bees, so to speak, to go achieve these. I don't really understand how it works. I'm just telling them, go do these things. In our particular company, that's not how it tends to work. And it tends to be the case that managers understand, are people who are good at doing the things that are being done by the people who work under them, so to speak. And so they tend to have a much greater understanding of the things that are being done. And so it's much easier to assess, should that be hard? Should I be impressed? Sometimes it's the other way around. Like there are things that are just taking an unbelievably long time, or they came out really mushed up. And you have to ask the question, was that in fact easy and the person just didn't do very well at it? Or was it actually hard for reasons that you didn't understand? And that's, again, a function of the style of management, at least we tend to practice at our company, that involves the people who are managing things actually understanding the functions that they are asking other people to do. Now, in terms of the sort of formal qualifications of education and so on, I mean, in our particular company, we really don't care. I mean, the question is, can the person do the job well? I think that it's often a convenient thing for companies to just say, to be a level X engineer, you have to have qualification Y. We don't happen to do that. I think that in most cases, what's relevant to whether somebody can do a job, the best indicator of whether somebody can do a job is whether the person is successfully doing that job, not whether the person has a degree in some fancy subject that might theoretically suggest that they should be able to do the job. It doesn't really tell you that. Much better information is, are they actually doing the job? Now, I suppose there's one case of that that's a slight sort of counterexample, which is there are places where people have got particularly professional degrees, I don't know, let's say lawyers, accountants, things like that, where sometimes there'll be sort of a range of things that come in, and you want some degree of confidence that if a thing comes in that wasn't part of the sort of the thing that you already knew they could do, that they have some knowledge of those kinds of things, that they can cover it. And that's because, and that's something where, having the educational qualification gives you some indication, they passed the CPA exam. Okay, that means they probably are going to know, how to do this thing, even though that wasn't something that's come up before in this particular organization. In other cases, where it's more sort of project-based work, it's really a question for management, I think, to be able to say, we've got this person, they've got these characteristics, these skills. I can tell what skills they have. Do those skills map onto the project I want? Much more so than saying, look at what, educational qualification they have and try and extrapolate from that whether they're going to be able to do this job. Now, there are things things go right, things go wrong occasionally with these kinds of topics. Like, for example, in our particular company, there are cases where some things we do involve quite a lot of mathy stuff. And it really is necessary for people to understand that mathy stuff. And I don't know whether it's a perfect indication, but it's sometimes an indication. If somebody got, a PhD in that kind of math, there's a good chance they'll understand that kind of math. There's a better chance in that case than somebody who didn't get any of those qualifications understanding it. But I think it's not certain in either side of that. So I tend to think the best evidence of being able to do a job well is doing the job well. Let's see, I think I need to rush off soon here, but okay, Golagaz compliments us by saying that our Wolfram language documentation is one of the best technical computing documentation. I hope I would even argue it might even be the best, but anyway. Well, I'll take one of the best. That's nice. Is there a general philosophy on balancing technical and business-oriented documentation in what we do? Well, actually, we have a big effort right now to explain our stuff more, because we are many decades ahead of the market, for example, in terms of what people sort of know that we have. And so for us, although we've got 100,000 pages or whatever of technical documentation, it's not enough. And we want to do more. But the question of what it takes to produce good technical documentation, I will say that, I used to write sort of all of our technical documentation back in the early decade, actually, of our company. And, I think I got pretty good at explaining what was going on in a fairly direct way, giving good, clean examples, things like this. I think that sort of defined a style that has been continued subsequently. And, who writes this stuff? Well, it's the people who build the software. It's the concept, excuse me a second. The concept that sort of one person will develop something and they understand it really well because they're developing it, they're involved in the design of it and so on. And then they say, okay, I've done that. Now I'm going to feed it to somebody else who's going to be the technical writer who's going to describe it. We tried doing that in the early years of the company, more than 30 years ago now. It was not successful, plainly not successful. For documentation of sort of the deep stuff that our technology does, Wolfram language and so on does, really that is best written by the people who develop it, with a definite set of guidelines and frameworks and checklists and so on of, and rules about what you're doing. Every example has to be lot more than, I don't know, a line or a line and a half long. The text above the examples has to be this length, all these kinds of things. It's kind of templated in that sense, but the actual content is really best determined by the people who are deepest into understanding the actual development process. Now, it's not true for everything. There are some things like, for example, workflows that describe interaction with external things, and where it's kind of a challenge to sort of explain the jungle that's out there. Some of those kinds of things, I think, are successfully done. Those are kind of high cost to do for the people who are deep in the development process. It can be just it's in the way that we set up our technical documentation, it's rather easy to write. I mean, sometimes if I see something where I think this example is missing, I'll literally pull up the source code page and I'll add that example and I'll press the appropriate buttons and I'm done in a minute. So we made it very easy to add things and so on. In the case of documenting sort of some complicated kind of what I might call sort of jungle workflow, so to speak, that involves, you have to connect to this other service and authenticate this, and then you have to copy this thing in this place and that place. Those are sort of high cost things to document. Those are complicated things to document, and those sometimes are often best done not by the people who actually develop the flow. As far as again, sort of marketing explanations for a product like ours that's really highly technical, most of that gets written by people who are, at the very least, often people who've developed it, sometimes people who are more involved in explaining it, but happen to be people who as individuals have, like, 1 hour programming competitions and things like this. So they're people who know our technology and use our technology a lot, even if they're not necessarily the people who are actually down in the creating code and so on. All right, maybe one more, and then I think I need to go. Let's see. Sorry, you guys have asked so many interesting questions. Okay. Dial asks, what advice do you have for someone who wants to pursue some academic field that's a bit unorthodox, like, say, our kind of physics as a graduate student? What I've been told is to save that for when you become a tenured professor. Yeah, well, that's like, do a lousy job all your life, and then when you retire, you can do what you think is fun, and you never get to retire. I don't think that's a good plan. I think the challenge, if you want to do something sort of entrepreneurial, those are the things that have the highest potential return, but they also require sort of the highest push to make happen in the world. And yes, you go to J Random Physics Department and you say, oh, what should I do? Well, okay, we've got this place for you. It's in the condensed matter lab. You'll be in this place on the you'll have this spot on the lab bench, and you'll be doing this thing, trying to get this piece of instrumentation to work. And if you do that for 5 years, you'll get a PhD. That's a little bit cynical to say, but that's a there's a definite box you can fit into it. There's definite funding. There's definite everything's all constructed. If you say, look, but those things have the expected return is comparatively low. The sort of the volatility, the amount of uncertainty about what's going to happen is also fairly low. You're going to be in that box. You can achieve a certain amount. If you put in this work, you'll get out this amount. If you are in a new sort of more entrepreneurial area, there's unbounded potential returns. In our physics project, for example, this is a period of low-hanging fruit. In 100 years ago, physics had sort of its a period of great expansion in the 1920s and so on with quantum mechanics. We're seeing the same kind of expansion today, and the same kind of there are these exciting things, and there are these people who are discovering them, and later textbooks will be written, and it'll be all about the so-and-so theorem or whatever, the so-and-so model or whatever else. And those will be the people who were, the random graduate student now who's studying that stuff. Those will be the people in the textbooks and the history books in the future. That's what happens if you're in one of these kind of low-hanging fruit to be picked, rapid advance entrepreneurial type fields. That's the good news. The bad news is, the standard sort of structure of this is how things work in our physics department or whatever. It's not set up for that, because you don't set things up for the 100-year progress. And fields, the field is sort of evolved around what happened, let's say, 100 years ago, and it's developed into this whole structure that supports that. Now, the good news, for example, with our physics project is that it really plugs very nicely into a lot of that structure. And a lot of what you can see coming out of the physics project, people say, oh, wow, that's cool, because it answers a question that I already have in this particular area of physics that I'm currently working on. And that's happened more at the level of sort of abstract formalism than it has at the level of do this experiment, see this, you've already got the apparatus to do the experiment. Hopefully that will happen next year or two, but that hasn't been the thing. It's more been, you've already got this formalism, now you can plug in what we're doing to that and see lots of interesting things happen. So, you have to understand kind of the structure of something like a physics department. There are people who have grants from which pay for, they sent in a thing to the National Science Foundation. They got a thing for studying this or that kind of, detailed thing. And they might say, you can't work on this new physics direction because my grant, which I can pay you out of, is for this. I would argue that with a bit of creativity, everybody wins in that situation, because let's say somebody has a grant to study, I don't know, granular materials, and you really want to work on the physics project that we've developed and the formalism for it. Well, I bet, I probably figured it out even right now, I bet there's a way to connect what the things that we can now see with our physics project to things that come up in studying granular materials, let's say. And if that's the case, then sort of it's an everybody wins situation, because you get to work on these things that work with this new formalism and do interesting things, but the funding agency, the professor, and so on get this extra boost to the thing that they were already doing. So that's a good thing. It takes creativity sometimes to see how those connections get made. I mean, I've actually been amazed with our physics project at the extent to which things which I was doing for quite different reasons. I mean, for example, in the meeting right before this one, we were talking about certain uses of a pattern matcher and certain ways in which you can have things where you're finding pieces of symbolic expressions that have particular forms. What if there are two pieces that kind of overlap that could both be said to have that form? How do you return that? And we were realizing that, gosh, it's the exact same problem as superposition in quantum mechanics. And we've got the same kind of observer theory approaches that can be taken to that, the same kind of ideas about foliations that can be taken to doing that. I never would have guessed that something about sort of quantum mechanics would show up in our discussion of things like expression pattern matching kind of code. But in that particular case, we didn't go to any effort to sort of bring those two things together. But when you do go to effort, I think you will often be able to find those connections. And I would say that the people who've been involved directly in our summer school physics project and so on, some of those people, including probably myself, would enjoy finding those connections. So for people who are like, in a physics department, the physics department says, this is all irrelevant to us. I bet it's not. And I bet the connection can be made and everybody will be excited and pleased by what comes out. Now, it is not to say that there aren't bumps in actually applying those ideas in the real world with people and with people's sort of personal pride and comfort level with different kinds of things that are going on. But I would say that you have to recognize that the moment of greatest potential return is the moment of greatest difficulty in fitting it into the sort of existing system. Now, another thing to say is it may often be a very personality dependent thing. It's not at the fanciest schools, nobody's going to go for it. It's not at the least fanciest schools, nobody's going to go for it. It's going to depend on, let's say there's a sort of a reigning professor who is in their, first they got tenure, 5 years ago, or they're rushing for tenure or whatever, and they're really on a roll, they're doing their thing. That person is probably not going to be, they're doing their thing, they're zooming forward with their thing, whatever it is. If you come in and say, hey, I've got another thing, let's do this instead, they're going to say, but I'm just barreling forward on what I'm already doing. I've got 10 years worth of work to do on what I'm already doing. I really don't want to know about this other thing on the side. But then there are other people who might be sort of the reigning professors, so to speak, who are not in that stage of life. They've I've worked on this, I've worked on the same kind of thing for 25 years. I kind of, it's all fun and interesting, and I could write another paper on the same topic. But you know what? If you've got something else that's interesting, hey, I want to learn about it. And that's that can be a different good situation. It's it's a place where kind of often the young and the old have shared interests, because the young are like, look, I can get into this thing. I'm not taking a big risk because I haven't built up this big sort of freight train going in that direction. The old are more like, well, I've pretty much, my freight train has come to the end of the line, so to speak, and I'd be excited to try something different and new. And so I think that's kind of a good case where that happens. Another case where that can happen is at depending on the level of student and things like this, at more kind of undergraduate-oriented schools like liberal arts colleges in the US, things like that, there can often be professors who are interested in helping people do research. And if they learn something about a new area, great. They're not so invested because they're not doing so much research themselves. They're not so deeply invested in some existing kind of freight train that's been set in motion. So, I mean, I think it can be complicated to find exactly those right places where, for one reason or another, there's a willingness to do new things. I mean, it's the same as, if you look across all people around the world and you say, who's going to be the person who will now sort of jump up and take advantage of this new opportunity that exists? We know both in business and in academia and in intellectual kinds of activities, it's a complicated mix. It's, who's there who is intellectually aligned with or skill aligned with the things that need to be done? That's first question. Second question is, who isn't in the middle of that decade-long kind of flight that they're already on, doing something? It's both an ability to do thing, and it's is it the right time in your life to do it? And I think that same thing is true with sort of injecting injecting new things. If you're both the person who's choosing to do the new things and the person who's choosing to, provide support for the new things, both sort of have to be at the right stage for it to really work. And, I think it has to be said that there are, people, when you look at, I don't know, professors at universities and things like that, people at different times in their life have different motivations for things. Like, for example, I'll take myself as an example. Back when I was a professor, long, long ago, one of the things about being a professor is you do teaching. Well, I just wasn't very interested in that. At the time, I was like, my big interest is in making research happen. Yeah, this teaching stuff, well, okay, fair enough, I could do that. I ended up having a chance to teach things that I thought were interesting and where I learned a bunch, but I wasn't really that interested in it. Now, you go a few decades later, and I find it really fun to explain things and to try and do sort of various kinds of teaching and educational kinds of things, because I'm at perhaps a different stage in my life. I've learnt that this is a great way for me to learn things. I didn't really understand that earlier on. I didn't have patience for it earlier on. Now, having said that, I think that in a sense, some aspects of sort of structured teaching, like, okay, do your exercises, do your homework, and so on. I'm probably not that into that right now either. I'm more into things where it's a question of providing an exposition that helps me understand something and getting challenged by questions that I didn't think of and that caused me to think in different directions. There's a question here, is it from Martian? Is there a way to contribute to science without a college degree? Absolutely. Depends on the field. I mean, for example, in this field that we call ruleology, studying simple programs and how they behave, kind of a thing that I did a lot of in my book, New Kind of Science. You've got the simple program, you see how it behaves, you're trying to analyze that, you're trying to see new phenomena that haven't been seen before. I don't think that a college degree as such, it's sort of a different story from whether you're good at doing that kind of thing. same is true with a lot of other areas of, in a sense, more observational science. Not all of them. I mean, some you need real skill to real learnt skill to be able to do that ecological field exploration. You don't really know what you're doing unless you've been trained for years about how to catch butterflies in the right way or whatever. But in there are plenty of areas of science, particularly the younger areas of science, where sort of there isn't a vast depth of things that's already known, and you can make frontier contributions by being very well organized, by sort of learning tools well and things like this. But those things don't really depend on, the college degree thing. Now, it helps in any of these things when you come to describe what you've done, and you've got to be able to explain yourself well. You've got to be able to present things in an expositorily useful way. And sometimes people learn that in college. Often I think people don't learn that in college. There are people who are quite young who know that very well, and there are people who have gone through endless education and don't learn that well. So, but that's an important skill, being able to, for example, use computational language, use Wolfram language and so on in doing rheology, let's say. That's a super important skill. Doing many areas of computational X, that's a kind of superpower skill. And by the way, you can learn that superpower even if you didn't go to college. In fact, it's regularly, we have our high school summer camp, and needless to say, people in high school haven't gone to college and they managed to get that superpower really quite well. So that's a thing that you can do. And once you have that kind of computational language superpower, it's remarkable how much you can contribute to lots of areas of science, kind of coming at them afresh with this computational point of view, rather than saying, well, I did all those college courses and they taught me all the conventional wisdom. You now have a new method, a new technique that allows you to go and explore even sort of the obvious questions in those fields. Now, there are areas where it's tough to get to them without the equivalent of a college degree, whether like, for example, physics. To contribute in frontline physics, you pretty much have to know a decent chunk of the canon of knowledge that exists in existing physics. And that sits on a tower of mathematics, and there is some depth there. And I mean, unless you're not going to be able to contribute meaningfully to things about, I don't know, particle physics, for example, unless you know a certain amount about quantum field theory. And quantum field theory sits on top of a pretty tall tower. Now, it's an interesting question whether our physics project is going to make that tower a little less tall. I kind of think not, unfortunately. I kind of think that while there are pieces of the assembly of that tower that are pretty accessible without knowing the quantum field theory stuff and all that kind of thing, what is happening with our physics project is you're substituting some kinds of aspects of what you had to know for quantum field theory for other kinds of abstract knowledge that is also not so easy to attain. Whether it's best attained, I mean, the colleges aren't yet teaching this stuff. Colleges are still teaching modern physics, where modern means it was invented 100 years ago. New term needed for the current round of things. But so I think there are areas like physics, like most areas of mathematics, where you kind of have to know that tower of existing knowledge in order to make a frontier contribution. There might be areas of mathematics, I would say, that are more kind of outlying areas which haven't been developed so much, but the ones that are sort of part of the mainstream, there's just been a lot of developments, and unless you know a decent chunk of that, it's hard to get to the front lines. When you're studying, how simple programs behave, well, I've studied that a bunch. Some other people have studied that a bunch. One of the things that's interesting about that is it's in a sense so hard that the people who have tall towers don't have much advantage over people who are just starting from the ground, because it's really so hard to make progress at some level, and in a sense so easy to make progress because it's all unexplored territory. So that's a pretty good place for sort of the a quick entry into sort of frontline science. Although it has to be said that, like other kinds of things, there's sort of a good way to do it and there's a not so good way to do it. You do computer experiments. It's very important to do the cleanest, simplest, most explainable computer experiments. When you come to explain things, it's important to explain them clearly, to give nice pieces of computational language code that present what you're talking about in a clear way that other people can use and so on. But those things, I don't think the college degree helps you much in those kinds of things. It might happen to teach you some things that are relevant, but it's off on the side relative to what's actually involved in making frontline science. All right. Harry comments, humans have been scientists long before there were college degrees, let alone colleges. Yeah, but science accelerated a lot after, really, the modern period of science, I would say, starts pretty firmly in the 1600s. And it is, many of those fields, it really got, towers started to be built. And that will happen with the things in rheology. That will eventually happen. Hasn't happened yet. So that's still an opportunity in an area. But you'll see areas. If you look at areas that had substantial kind of contribution from people who didn't do all the college degree kind of thing. Well, of course, there were times when history was, when just the world was a bit different, and in the Ada Lovelaces of this world, no, they didn't get college degrees. They had some tutors who taught them things, and then they went off and tried to figure stuff out. It was other kinds of situations like that, where for one reason or another, people didn't go through the sort of traditional go to this esteemed place and get your degree type thing, and yet they were able to make contributions. Sometimes, one of the things that's always a challenge about making original contributions is how much existing stuff should you know? My attitude is it's worth knowing as much as you can get yourself to learn based on the things you really want to know. But if you kind of just learn, and you kind of fill yourself up with the existing knowledge, it can be increasingly difficult to see that original thing that isn't just something that is incremental on existing knowledge, because your brain is sort of full of all these things. Oh, of course we know how that works because, I read something about this here, and, somebody must know that, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Sometimes knowing less is actually a good thing. I suppose what I tend to do is I tend to want to ask, I try to ask you sort of foundational questions, and sometimes there's a little bit of stuff that's been done on the foundational questions. I try to understand that. But in a sense, the tower that was built on top of those foundations is less important to know in detail, except as a way to kind of theme what direction you're going in. And so it's less necessary. You don't have to have learned the whole tower in order to make sort of a foundational contribution sometimes, although it's really useful to have a knowledge of that tower as kind of a background for where you're trying to go. All right, I should wrap up here. Well, thanks for lots of interesting questions and comments, and I look forward to doing this another time. Thanks a lot, and bye for now.